Hello, this is Dan Damon with your World Update Daily Commute, recorded on Tuesday at 5:30 a.m. US East Coast time. Coming up, Barack Obama delivers his last address to the American people as president. A presidential speechwriter tells us in the age of digital communication, lofty oration may be out of step with what the American people want.
I don't know that these days that people are looking for complicated, big, soaring statements so much as I just want to know, cut to the chase, what's the bottom line?
Norway challenges a ruling that it treated the jailed mass murderer Anders Breivik inhumanely. And we'll have a report into big changes expected for the World Cup. FIFA's planning to expand the competition to 48 teams.
When we speak about expansion, we speak about inclusion. We speak about allowing more countries to participate in the biggest social and sporting event of the world.
First, the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. Tens of thousands of Iranians have attended the funeral of the former president Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani in Tehran. Prayers were led by the supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. A huge crowd of mourners thronged the streets as his coffin was taken for burial in the crypt of Ayatollah Khomeini, the figurehead of the Islamic Revolution. Some people chanted the name of his more reformist successor, Mohammad Khatami. The governing body of world football, FIFA, has approved plans to expand the World Cup from 32 to 48 teams from the year 2026. The bulk of the additional slots are likely to go to African and Asian countries. The US Senate begins confirmation hearings for Donald Trump's cabinet nominees today. The first will be of his choice for Attorney General, Senator Jeff Sessions, who's been accused of racial insensitivity and a bias against migrants. The normally neutral American Civil Liberties Union has asked to testify in order to highlight his record. The number of people kidnapped at sea has risen to its highest level in 10 years. 62 people were taken for ransom across the world in 2016, a threefold increase on the year before. Human rights organisations are holding a day of demonstrations across Pakistan's main cities, demanding that action be taken to trace 4 secular activists who've gone missing within the past week. All had expressed views critical of extremism and intolerance. Human Rights Watch said they were also vocal critics of the military establishment. The former German President Roman Herzog has died at the age of 82. The Conservative politician and former chairman of the Constitutional Court held the largely ceremonial post in the latter half of the 1990s. He's best remembered for a speech in Berlin in 1997 after a visit to Asia. He berated his countrymen for being risk-averse. BBC News.
Hello, this is Dan Damon with World Update from the BBC in London. Coming later on our programme, what Japanese scientists say is newly discovered anyway, in the Earth's core. That's to come later with our science correspondent Rebecca Morrell. First, is Donald Trump's appointment of his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, legal under federal anti-nepotism laws, which were designed to prevent family ties from influencing the government? The Democrats in the US Congress said that they are not thinking that's legal. They've called for a review of the appointment. The Trump transition team argues the law barring public officials from giving jobs to relatives doesn't apply to the White House. Here's our Washington correspondent, Anthony Zercher.
There's a lot of ethics lawyers, government lawyers who have come out and said that this law covers the White House in addition to the executive offices outside the White House, agencies and cabinet. But if you look at the language, it says agency, and they say, well, the White House is not an agency. So it's a kind of a gray area that the Trump team appears to be exploiting.
Amid those controversies, the Republican-controlled US Senate will today begin confirmation hearings for members of the Trump administration. As that administration takes shape, the Obama administration winds down, and the president will deliver his farewell address to the American people today from his home city, Chicago. What might we expect? We'll get the views of an ex-presidential speechwriter in a moment. First, just let's listen to some parts of the most memorable speeches from President Obama over the past 8 years.
Today, I say to you that the challenges we face are real. They are serious and they are many. They will not be met easily or in a short span of time. But know this, America, they will be met.
The alleged killer could not imagine how the city of Charleston, under the good and wise leadership of Mayor Riley, how the state of South Carolina, how the United States of America would respond not merely with revulsion at his evil act, but with big-hearted generosity, and more importantly, with a thoughtful introspection and self-examination that we so rarely see in public life.
When politicians insult Muslims, whether abroad or our fellow citizens, when a mosque is vandalized or a kid is called names, that doesn't make us safer. That's not telling it like it is. It's just wrong. It diminishes us in the eyes of the world.
Some of Barack Obama's rhetoric. Annika Green is a senior director at the White House Writers Group. Previously, she served in President George W. Bush's speechwriting office. So I asked Annika how the president might be preparing for this speech.
It would be the entire office in the same way that like a State of the Union address would be. And it, of course, doesn't start with the speechwriting staff. It starts with the senior advisors and the president himself, who will be thinking, what do we want to say in our last moments as the leader of this nation? The tradition was set by George Washington, who was our first president, and his speech was so important and seminal that the U.S. Congress used to read it every year up until the 1970s to try to remember some of the principles that Washington laid out that were for his administration, but really, as the first president, it was a lot of national principle. And James Madison worked on that draft, as did Alexander Hamilton, who has become more popular again recently because of the musical. But it is a very important opportunity for a president to have a final word on what he thinks his legacy is and what he hopes it will historically remain.
What do you think President Obama will want to leave behind?
Well, he's in a really tricky position. I have some sympathy for him in the sense that all the things he's worked for 8 years, the next president, the incoming president-elect, has said explicitly, I want to undo this. A lot of President Obama's policies have been harmful to, I'd say that even the framework of government, particularly his unilateral executive actions. I don't think he's going to be looking to defend that particular part of his legacy, but I do think he will talk about Obamacare. And really, in keeping with farewell addresses, he will talk about the principles behind how he governed and what his philosophy was, his governing philosophy, and why he believes that that was not only beneficial to the nation, but what he thinks should continue. So I would not be surprised if some of what he says publicly, it matches with what he probably said to Donald Trump in their meeting after Trump won the election.
Is it typical to warn that his successor might make mistakes?
I don't think it's typical for a president talking about his own time in office to then try to take a pot shot about his successor. I mean, I think most of the time, and you see this across parties, it's one of the beauties of the American system, I'd say, there is a sort of presidential club. It's like you're an alumni of it. You see this with George W. Bush and President Obama. When the George W. Bush Presidential Library opened and Obama came down, there's a lot of affection between those men, even though they couldn't be more different in terms of policy and how they choose to govern. But once you've held the office of president, you really want the next person to succeed, even if you disagree with them. And that's something that we've seen from President Obama from the time it became clear that Hillary Clinton would not be the next president. I think everybody, no matter how much you may have not supported President-elect Trump, they want to see him succeed. He's leading our nation. So that does become a reference point to call for unity.
And finally, Annika, let me just ask you, perhaps it's unfair, but to do a comparison. Barack Obama prides himself really on soaring rhetoric, doesn't he? And here we have Donald Trump, who likes simple words, pretty limited vocabulary, really. How would you compare the two as people who will have to stand in front of the American people and give a speech?
So Donald Trump, I think, really is a man for our age. When you think about when Barack Obama came into office in 2008, 2009, I don't think we even had Twitter yet. Facebook was starting to catch on. There weren't as many digital outlets sort of pouring information at people all the time. You wake up in the morning, you look at your phone, how many news flashes do you have? How many letters telling you what's going on? Text messages from people. I don't know that these days that people are looking for complicated, big, soaring statements so much as I just want to know, cut to the chase, what's the bottom line? Don't call me on the phone. Send me a text. Just give me, the very bare piece of information that I can absorb and think about. And I think that Donald Trump is well positioned for that in moving forward.
Annika Green, Senior Director at the White House Writers Group. This is World Update. In July 2011, the Norwegian right-wing nationalist Anders Breivik went on a killing spree. He murdered 77 people, most of them teenagers attending a Labour Party youth camp. There's no death sentence or mandatory life sentence in Norway. The judge passed a sentence of 21 years in prison. That can be extended if Breivik is still considered a threat. In April last year, a lower court found that Breivik's treatment in prison violated a ban on, to quote, inhuman and degrading treatment under the European Convention on Human Rights. The Norwegian government today is contesting that decision. Valeria Christiani is a journalist. She covers this story in Oslo. What's the basis, I asked, of the government's appeal?
The basis of the appeal this week is that the Norwegian government is appealing against a judgment last year which found that Anders Behring Breivik had been breached on Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Basically, he was treated inhumanely in prison over his length of time. However, he did lose on one part of the case, which was Article 8, right to private life. But that will also be addressed here because Breivik is appealing that decision, which he lost. So there are, in fact, two things going on in the court case.
What was the particular aspect of his regime in prison that the lower court found was inhumane?
What was particularly damning for the correctional system here was that he had been held in isolation for what was not really based on sufficient grounds. He had been subject, for example, to hundreds of naked strip searches and use of handcuffs. And the court basically found that the threshold had been reached, that it was inhumane. The government is arguing that the court put that threshold way too low. And I think they were taken by surprise in the lower court because no one really thought that a murderer could be found to have been treated inhumanely. Like the government attorney said, prison is an uncomfortable place. It's not expected to be otherwise.
Well, it's not all that uncomfortable for him, is it, some would say?
Now, compared to the U.S. prison systems, obviously, this is, I wouldn't say luxurious, but it is humane in that sense. He has private cells. He has 3 to himself, but it's the level of isolation. And in this appeal case, they're going to be focusing on his mental vulnerability.
And is there a situation that is threatening? One of the reasons given for his isolation is that he would be in danger from other prisoners.
Exactly. That is the Attorney General's argument, that he has said in his manifesto, which he released shortly after the killing spree, that he would use prison as a vehicle to spread his message, to promote National Socialism. And his court appearance last year in the lower courts, he gave the Nazi salute, and he talked about his plans to release a book, and he specifically wants contact with other inmates.
And his lawyer is arguing about his mental vulnerability. Didn't he utterly resist the idea that he was insane?
Yes, this is a complete paradox because part of his legal argument in the criminal court was that he wanted his followers to find that he was credible in his propaganda, in his message, and that was only possible, obviously, if he was sane. But now he's using this for his advantage, and he's also using the same court system which he initially said that he felt had no legitimacy. In the criminal court case, that was his opening line to the judge, I don't believe in this court system. And now he's using it several times.
Valeria Christiani, a journalist in Oslo. Can you have too much of a good thing? Football's world governing body, soccer's world governing body, FIFA, has decided their 4-yearly tournament, the World Cup, should be expanded from 32 to 48 teams. Our sports correspondent Alex Capstick reports from FIFA headquarters in Zurich.
It's a fresh morning up on the hill on the outskirts of Zurich. I'm at FIFA's headquarters, and the complex includes quite a few football pitches. On one of them, a match is taking place. It involves the so-called legends of the game, and there are some illustrious names. They include Maradona. There he is, demanding the ball. Much slower, much bigger than he was in his prime, but still capable of one or two fancy skills. They're in town for the glittering Player of the Year awards ceremony, but it's in a committee room inside the fortress-like building which stands next to the pitch they're playing on, where a decision which will have a far greater impact on the global game is going to be made.
When we speak about expansion, we speak about inclusion. We speak about allowing more countries to participate in the biggest social and sporting event of the world.
It's almost a year since Gianni Infantino succeeded Sepp Blatter at the head of world football. He was elected on a promise of change, and that includes expanding the World Cup.
This is the biggest boost that we can give to football development. There is nothing better for a country to qualify and for several countries to hope to qualify in order to boost the football movement.
It's an idea which appeals to those confederations who have felt underrepresented at football's showpiece, like Asia, the Americas and Africa. Here's South Africa's former captain Lucas Radebe, who stopped for a quick word shortly after the final whistle in the exhibition game.
I think it's important that at least they expand it, give more chances to other countries to come in and enjoy the game.
The argument against it is it will dilute the quality of the tournament.
I don't think so. I think it will only improve the game, in the continent.
Here at FIFA HQ, 5 proposals are up for consideration, but there is one clear favourite, a 48-team competition which will start with 16 groups of 3, followed by a straight knockout round of 32. One of its big attractions is that it would be the same duration as the existing format. Gianni Infantino's plans will undoubtedly win him many friends across football's political landscape. They'll also swell FIFA's already bulging coffers, and some have questioned the true motivation for the revamp. Amongst them, the Arsenal manager, Arsene Wenger.
Is that guided for popular reasons, or is that guided to improve the level of football? I'm a bit sceptical, but if somebody can convince me that it will make football better, I'm ready to listen. At the moment, I'm not convinced.
Most of the objections to expansion have come from Europe. With a guaranteed 13 slots, it's the confederation with by far the largest slice of the World Cup pie. Michel Dog, a Belgian, has spent nearly 3 decades at the top table in both UEFA and FIFA.
In a situation like we have now with 32 teams, the 2 finalist players are playing 7 matches. It must not become 8 matches or 9 matches. This is one of the essential criteria. Secondly, I think we must also keep the level of the quality of the World Cup. And I think that with some formulas, this is possible.
Has Europe accepted that this is a done deal, that expansion is now going to happen, and therefore there is no point in objecting to it, trying to swim against the tide?
I think if you go to a vote, let's say that if some Europeans, for instance, would be negative towards an expansion, I think they will lose on the vote. But the point is that we are not so negative towards it.
Total number of valid votes for Gianni Infantino, 115.
It seems inevitable that less than 12 months into his new job, Gianni Infantino will make good on his pledge to broaden the World Cup. It won't please everybody, but crucially, the vast majority of FIFA's members are firmly behind him.
A report from Alex Capstick, just to repeat that decision has been made, and the World Cup will go to 48 teams in 16 rounds. You're listening to World Updates from the BBC. Top stories just now. Huge crowds will have attended the funeral in Tehran of the former Iranian President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. He's being buried next to the leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini. This is the BBC in London. Well, let's have a soundscape. Update soundscapes@gmail.com. And we've got some great ones that we've not had the time to put in, so we're going through and coming up with some of them that are maybe a couple of weeks old, but they're still excellent. This one is from Pete Stang We're eavesdropping at the University of Oregon. Pete says he cleans the music school. He recorded a student practicing on the other side of a closed door. That's the kind of thing we love. Sounds that you just find in your world. Update soundscapes@gmail.com. That's Pete Stang. Thanks very much indeed for that, Pete. Update soundscapes@gmail.com. The Brazilian government has defended its controversial dam building program in the Amazon. Brazil plans to build dozens of huge hydroelectric dams across the region. It says it'll boost the economy, harness the country's natural resources and provide clean energy. Well, they would say that, but environmentalists say the plan is a disaster for the Amazon. Actually, it'll result in more deforestation and global warming. Our Brazil correspondent, Wira Davis, has visited the first of the mega dams, called Belo Monte, and spent some time with indigenous communities whose lands and villages stand in the way of the dams.
Rising out of the world's greatest rainforest, a huge concrete monolithic monument to progress. The Belo Monte hydroelectric dam is the fourth largest in the world and cost about $18 billion to build. It's been mired in allegations of corruption and has created a huge lake, radically altering the course and flow of one of the biggest rivers in the Amazon, the Xingu. There's been a human cost too. The local fishing industry has been decimated and thousands of riverside dwellers, ribeirinhos, have lost their land and their livelihoods, forced into an alien urban environment.
E às vezes não revolta, porque a gente vê essas pessoas ganhando milhões e milhões em cima do que é nosso.
It makes us angry, says Gilmar Gomes, showing me his now worthless fishing licence. These corporations are generating energy from the river and are making huge profits from what used to be ours, he says. But we're not able to use the river anymore.
O que é nosso, nós não pode pisar.
Building the dam brought hundreds of jobs to the riverside town of Altamira, but it also led to increasing deforestation and the permanent loss of many low-lying river islands. Supporters of hydropower admit mistakes were made, but they say the rivers and their energy are there to be harnessed for the greater good of Brazil. Luis Barroso is president of the Brazilian government's energy planning agency.
I would definitely defend it. I think it makes sense for the country. That's a resource for the country. In the developed part of the world, almost 70% of the hydro potential has already been explored. In Brazil, almost 70% of our hydro potential has not been explored yet.
Next in line for development is the Tapajós, described as the most beautiful river in the Amazon region and home to the Munduruku indigenous people. A plan to build several dams along its length would transform this wide, shallow river into a navigable water highway, but it would flood forests and islands used by the Munduruku for centuries. Touring the Munduruku's territory, tribal chief Cacique Juarez Munduruku showed me how technology is helping the tribe. GPS mapping helping to prove that any dam built here would permanently flood land legally belonging to the tribe.
Eu já conversei com os pessoal onde foi construído as barragens.
I've seen these so-called developments, the dams and the barrages. They don't bring any benefits to the people. That's why we are against them. There's not one place where a dam has been built that has turned out good for locals and for our tribes. There's only misery and complaints.
É só reclamação.
Sometimes described as a clean energy, environmental campaigners like Lisa Gunn say hydropower, especially in the Amazon, is anything but. The construction process is destructive and flooded forests produce tons of greenhouse gases. She argues that a hot and windy country like Brazil should be investing in other alternatives.
We are not choosing between hydroelectric and oil. We are choosing between hydroelectric and solar energy. We need the standing forest for the sake of the forest people, but also for the climate, the global climate. And I think that the idea is that we do not need to destroy here in order to have energy for Brazilian development.
The painted and tattooed men and women of the Munduruku have a fearsome reputation for defending their land, but they're taking on powerful business and political interests. Proposals are already being debated in the Brazilian Congress that would weaken existing environmental laws and slash funding for forest protection. And the Munduruku say that yet again, their people are in a battle to save their way of life and their river.
That's Wera Davis reporting from the Amazon in Brazil. Japanese scientists say they may have established the identity of a mystery element within the Earth's inaccessible core. Our science correspondent Rebecca Morell is here. How did they do that?
Well, this is such an interesting study, kind of taking us on a little journey to the very centre of the Earth. So we think the inner core is a solid ball about 1,200 kilometres across, and we think it's mainly made up of iron, about 85% of its weight, and nickel, about 10% of its weight. That leaves 5% that we don't know about. Now, obviously, we can't study the core directly. It's 5,000 kilometres beneath our feet. We can drill down a little bit, but nowhere near that. So you've got two ways of actually looking at it. The first way is to pass seismic waves, see what happens as seismic waves pass through the Earth and see how they change as they move from one side to the other. And that gives you a sense of what's going on in there. The other way of doing this is to actually recreate the conditions of the inner core in a laboratory. And that's what this team in Japan have been doing. They've been subjecting lots of different elements to incredibly high temperatures and incredibly high pressures and seeing which of these elements match most closely with the data they get from the seismic waves. And they think they've identified the missing element as silicon.
Can you send a seismic wave from here to Australia?
Well, seismic waves kind of pass through the Earth all the time. So whenever there's an earthquake, the waves generated by kind of rumbles in the Earth do just move through the Earth. So they happen naturally. So we just record what's happening. It's kind of a useful artifact of an earthquake, actually. You know, they cause devastation in some places, but it can tell you a little bit about what's going on in the centre of the Earth. And that's how we really know, know in inverted commas, we think. We're pretty sure that it's a solid ball down there, and we're pretty sure that the elements that are in there. And it's silicon. Yes, silicon. So you might say, well, who cares? That's very exciting. But, I'm a chemist. I like silicon. It's a cool element. But other than that, it's very, very important to know what's down there because it tells you something about how the Earth was formed. So our solar system formed 4.6 billion years ago, and rocks came together to make the Earth, and they aggregated. And for a while, the Earth was a sort of ball of molten rock, but then slowly it solidified, the crust formed out, and then you had the liquid inside, which turned into this solid inner core. So actually seeing what's in there gives you an idea of the process that actually happened. But I think the coolest thing about this is actually they think that there are now alloys down there of nickel and iron and silicon, which would be enormous crystals, enormous, beautiful, pristine crystals. I mean, they've got no way of knowing this for certain. But if you do the kind of chemistry up here on Earth, that's what should be at the centre of the Earth. But unfortunately, we can't really go down there to take a look. It's all liquid, I guess, is it? No, that's the weird thing about it. You'd think it would be liquid, but the pressures are so great that it's actually a solid in the centre. So it'd be these solid crystalline structures. Now, outside of that, the outer core, that is liquid. And beyond that, the mantle, that's a really viscous liquid. And then you've got the crust above that. So you've got all these kind of layers of Earth that peel away. But amazingly, the centre, and that's what gives the Earth magnetism, the iron, the solid iron down there. That's why we have magnetic poles, and that's why we have magnetism on Earth. I'm sure you're right, but I still prefer the Jules Verne version, that there are gardens down there and unknown tribes. Well, there might be. You never know. One day we might find a way of actually getting down there to see, but at the moment it looks pretty unlikely. So these kind of experiments up on the surface and the labs here are helping us. But yeah, it's an amazing way of looking at the Earth. Thank you very much indeed. That's our science correspondent, Rebecca Morell. You're listening to World Update landscapes@gmail.com. Where would you go if life gets tough where you are now? Have you got a picture of it? Send it to updatelandscapes@gmail.com. If you've been to the centre of the Earth, then please, we'd like that. And join us for more World Update tomorrow.